wondering, like I could make out like blues, but not reds or yellows or anything like that. And I remember I could see the spectrum of blue. You could almost make it out in certain stars, or depending on how close they were. And I remember as we got older, he then advanced into telescope, and then he advanced into what do they call that? Astrophotography, where you actually hook up a camera to the telescope and then take pictures, and you basically hook it up to a laptop, or that the telescope has little stepper motors in it that you can tell it to move with relation to a fixed point. So let's say you were looking at the third star in Orion's belt, let's say, and you were wanting to take some prolonged photographs of that, where you would prolong the exposure to allow maximum light to come in to that exposure, so you could actually see everything that was, all the different spectrums, if you will. And so I always thought that was very interesting, that it would take this prolonged exposure, but you could do it timed, because if you were just to set the telescope up, you would just get a blur of lights, because the Earth, of course, is rotating against the backdrop of the heavens. So why am I saying all this? I remember being young, in this concept of return to innocence, of the frustration that when the photograph came out, when we looked at it on the computer screen, and this is of course when I was older, but still, nonetheless, the beauty and the magnificence that could be seen of this prolonged exposure, much like the images of the Hubble, which is far greater than you can get from any Earth-based telescope, just because you don't have the atmosphere that can skew the light and change the light waves. You're actually getting more of a realistic view, from outer space. But I don't know anyone amongst us that really has the money to do something like that, other than, of course, the government and NASA and all that. So, but I always wondered about that I always felt it frustrating that I could only see in part. I could only see a glimpse of this heavenly glory. And, so it reminded me of hearing and seeing. And, as it's likened to perfect vision for a human being is 20/20 vision. Also, hearing is 20/20 of an infant before the hearing is damaged. That an infant can also hear in 20/20 from 20,000 hertz. I'm sorry, 20,000 hertz down to 20 hertz is considered for human perfect hearing. And I just was marveling at the 20/20 and 20/20. So, thinking about this and going back to this innocence of this desire, this also brought me back to a time, and this was something that I was also very, very interested in as a child, was sound. I was always amazed with that, and always felt very, very blessed to be able to hear, even though my hearing is not as sharp or as great as others, and has been greatly diminished over the years. I remember my dad always having this appreciation for music and sound, and wanting a very close replication to that sound, meaning I always took notice of, we would go on camping trips, and or just being outside and hearing the wind in the trees, the leaves rustling, or just the birds chirping, or being outside in the rain. I remember just sitting outside in the rain and just listening to the rain and hearing it hit all the different things and all the different resonations. But I always had this desire that I wished I could see those resonations, what would that look like? And I remember with having this fascination, that it brought me into a fascination of building speakers, which I started at a very, very young age. I think we started messing around with stereo equipment and speakers as young as I think it was like 9 or 10. And I remember rebuilding an amplifier with my dad at age 12. And from there, I just took off and started buying books, and started learning about frequencies and crossovers, and all the different types of speakers, from mid-range to woofers to subwoofers to tweeters to all the equations and the values that were within that, and the actual construction of the speakers, and how they are designed specifically to reproduce a range of frequencies, and how that correlated with dampening effects, meaning where they were placed in a room. What was in the room, what would cause the frequencies to change or oscillate differently, the different types of wood that you would use for the enclosure of the speakers, that would increase or decrease dampening effects, and increase or decrease what's called colorization of the sound, meaning that the speaker itself was not being true to its input, but adding colorization or adding its own waves, and not giving you the truest reproduction of that sound. Now, so this quest for me, was to have this closest reproduction of the sound that was recorded, which, then depended upon how good was the recording. So there's so many different factors, but just narrowing it down to taking this reproduction of all the frequencies that were allowed within it and trying to reproduce that in its entirety into the clearest, almost a 1-to-1 ratio, if you will. That was what you were going for. You were trying to have a 1-to-1 ratio between the recording and the playback, or the admittance of those frequencies into the space, or the listening space. So this was my quest, which was, it is kind of a little bit of a lonely world, because how many 10 and 12-year-olds, that's their quest. And with limited funds and limited means, how close could I get to that actual reproduction? Not very. To really get good equipment cost quite a bit of money, which I didn't have. So I got very, very creative within what I could afford, and working little odd jobs, and mowing lawns and all that stuff, of how could I best recreate sound. And that's quite a fun chapter. I remember this one time my dad realized how into it I was, and kind of wanted to give me a goal to shoot for. So he took me into a very, very, they don't really have them anymore, unfortunately. I used to enjoy going to these very high-end stereo or speaker stores, this high-end equipment, if you will. And I remember he took me into one in I think it was Denver, Colorado. And I don't remember the name. I was very, very young, but the impression that it made on me was immense. And but it brought about the same frustration that I found earlier on in my childhood as well. And we'll get to that in just a second. Excuse me. Take a sip here. So it got me thinking about. Well, I'm sorry. So so my dad took me to this speaker store, or the stereo store, or whatever you want to call it, and oh goodness, I don't remember the name of the speakers. Not that it's important. I just remember closing my eyes. They had put on music, and it wasn't at high volume. It was actually very low volume that they were at, and it was a Caribbean style music that they had put on. The salesperson, and we really had no business being in there. There was no way we could afford any of the equipment, but I think my dad just thought I would enjoy it, and I did immensely, and it was eye-opening that the reproduction of this sound. I remember there was it was, like I said, it was a Caribbean style sound, meaning there was steel drums and timbales and horns and brass section, and I remember each sound seemed to come alive, like I could almost touch it, like certain frequencies just stood out. The steel drum, I felt like the guy was literally in the room playing the steel drum in front of us, and when the horns came up, it was you could feel it. It was just powerful. And it was it made such an impression on me that I was like, wow, that's what I would like to achieve. It set this mark, this bar, that I wanted to achieve that, but I still had this desire, this nagging desire that I couldn't, though I could hear it and experience it on that level, I couldn't touch it. I really wish that I could freeze time and see the frequencies and how they actually were displacing the air around us. I wanted to see in whole, but not in part. I wanted to hear in whole and not in part. And so I was very frustrated, even though, much like right now, I feel a frustration because I'm limited to, I've been calling myself the one-handed bandit. I'm limited to one hand, and that can be somewhat frustrating. So, going back to this childhood, I felt this same sort of frustration of a limitation. And this really got me thinking, how come I could not see? Because the wires were clear going up. You could see, this will give you insight to the wires feeding the speaker from the amplifier were pure gold and pure silver. So that way the transmission of the electrical current, that AC current going to the speaker, was as pure as it could be. Normally copper wire can tint that, where the silver and the gold are excellent conductors of this energy, of this electricity, of this frequency flowing through them. But I wanted to see that, because it was clear and you could see the gold, you could see the silver, but I couldn't see the energy flowing. And I found that also somewhat frustrating, as if there was a wall an impenetrable wall between me and this other universe, this other world that I knew existed. It's there. I can prove it mathematically.